Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I, instead of a weekly chat this week, we're publishing this episode that we recorded a couple of weeks ago about how we think about processing information, dealing with information in an era of too much information being available online. We've got deep fakes and AI and everything else happening. So it's a conversation about how to think about information in general. I'm obviously out this week, so this is one of the episodes we saved, so that you still have content while I'm out. If any of this is interesting to you, a lot of it goes into both how we provide research and knowledge and consulting services. Also, a lot of what we're talking about here relates back to our wealth management strategies. And if you are interested in becoming a client or hearing more about those, email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. But without further ado, here's Rob. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right. Hello, listeners. Rob told me that he was headed to Versailles immediately after we recorded this podcast. So in preparation, I rewatched The Man in the Iron Mask last night because I thought it was going to be really pertinent to what was going on here. But Rob is not going to Versailles. He's stuck in Paris because he has stuff to do. How's it going, Rob?
It's going well. It's going well. I didn't realize The Man in the Iron Mask was a Versailles thing.
It's a Louis XIV thing, and you said that you were going to visit the Sun King, and I saw Sun King, and then my mind was like, the baby is away with her grandmother for a night. Meghan is upstairs studying for a final. You're by yourself. Do you want to, watch the new Next Generation basically series with Patrick Stewart, or do you want to fire up an old classic? And I fired up an old classic. There you are. But maybe The Man in the Iron Mask is actually an unattended good metaphor for the topic that we're going to tackle here, which is information being the iron mask that closes it in. I might be working a little too hard for that metaphor, but it might come. We'll see as we go. But the main focus of this podcast, listeners, is going to be about how to consume information. Because Rob, I don't know if you feel this way, but the two questions I get asked most often. Number one is, when is China going to invade Taiwan? And I do it's not going to invade Taiwan thing. And then the second question is always, what do I need to read to become a geopolitical analyst or to get a job to do the stuff that you're doing? And that really goes right into what you wanted to talk about here and what we're going to talk about on this podcast, which is, what should you read? How should you interact with information? How do you deal with a media environment that is full of increasingly more information over time, and how to parse it, especially when you have limited time and things like that? So that's going to be the topic of conversation here today. And I thought we'd start off, Rob, you raised this idea ahead of time, the depreciable life of information. And I liked the use of the concept of depreciability there. So why don't you just kind of start there, and we'll wend our way through what we want to tell the listeners.
Sure. Well, the background to this is I've been doing a lot of thinking about this over the years, naturally, and recently really sat down and put some of these thoughts down on paper. And I'm hoping that at the end of this conversation, some of the listeners, who I know by definition, they're here because they're curious about the world, they're reading and consuming information. I'm hoping that they'll come away with this, from this, with a few ideas about how to optimize the way that they consume information. And this is based on long trial and error and learning, and spending many, many, many hours in the depths of rabbit holes. So there's a few big ideas, and as you mentioned, the depreciable life of information is one of them. And what this essentially means is, I find it helpful to picture everything that you consume along a spectrum. And the spectrum is the depreciable life. So to use a nerdy accounting analogy, every asset has a depreciable life. Some things are longer, some things are shorter. And it's just a fancy way of saying, how long is that information interesting or useful or valuable to you? And on the one end of that spectrum is the day-to-day news, the stuff that you're reading every day in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, New York Times, those kinds of newspapers. And the depreciable life of that is extremely short. So, you've mentioned this before. I think you've been looking at the headlines from a year ago at some point, and how many of those things you even remember at the time, right? The vast majority of everything that we read in the news, we don't give two craps about within a few days or even a few hours sometimes. And I always love this quote from Charles Lamb, the essayist from the 19th century. And he said, "Newspapers always excite curiosity. No one ever lays one down without a feeling of disappointment." And it's kind of true, because we always are attracted to the news. It's new by definition, but then very quickly it loses its luster. It's like a sliced up apple. So that's on the one end of the spectrum, the very, very shortest end. And then that spectrum just extends from there. So as you go beyond news, you have, I would say like nonfiction books that are more issues based. So books about current events, about some kind of issue that is changing, but is not changing every day, reports, that kind of thing. And then you move a little farther down the spectrum, and you have books, you have sort of background materials about how do things work, whether that's some technology, a business model, a nation, an institution, sort of the fundamentals beneath things. And that's mostly books. That could be history, that can be textbooks, whatever that is. That's at the very far end of the spectrum. So that has a very long depreciable life. If you spend an hour reading that knowledge is going to be useful for a very long time. And then at the very far end, I would say you have what I would call wisdom, which is how do people work? And that encompasses everything from, the Bible to Shakespeare or whatever it may be. Now, you can't sit around all day reading the Bible. It's not going to help you very much if you're an investor. But the point here is, if you think of your information consumption along that spectrum, how do you optimize that? And I think what's pretty clear is right now what most people do is they operate in sort of a pyramid. So the base of the pyramid is the shortest lived stuff, the stuff that gets churned out every day. We spend more time reading news than we do reading books, than we do reading Wikipedia articles about how nuclear energy works, those sorts of things. And that, I think, is a major deficiency. It's a major bias that you can go a long way to correct by being just a little more thoughtful about what goes into your reading, because the default is always going to be that pyramid. And I think that pyramid needs to, in many ways, be flipped upside down, where the news, the stuff that depreciates almost immediately, you need to be very selective about what you actually spend time with, and the rest of it you need to throw out. You need to flip the pyramid upside down. So that's the first kind of big idea that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, let's stick with it a while, because I have a lot of different thoughts. I can't remember. I don't think I said this on a podcast recently. I think I was talking to somebody who was looking for advice about getting into geopolitics, and they were asking me what to read. And it's difficult with news. The one thing that has really changed, and it's really changed since the internet, so the last 20 or 30 years, is it used to be that the job of analysis or research or intelligence or whatever was gathering information for was to get a hold of information, because information was hard to get to. And that has also reversed. So now we have too much information. We have never lived at a time where there was more information available at your fingertips than ever before. And sort of by definition, when something hits a newspaper already, it's already common knowledge. The depreciable life has already begun. A piece of information that nobody knows about yet, or that a very small number of people know about, or that has not hit sort of public knowledge yet, that you haven't even started depreciating there. There you still have an asset whose value is still really strong. By the time it gets to a newspaper, everybody sort of has their hands on it or has the opportunity to have their hands on it. And at that point, it becomes, do you have some unique insight about the piece of information? Can you link it to something else that nobody's thought about? Do you think about it in a completely different way than most people are thinking about it? And does that let you sort of change the way things are going? But the information is already there. And whereas before it was about trying to gather information that, trying to fill in the pieces just from what was in the newspaper has everything right now. So that's one thought. Another thought is that, I think in some ways maybe it's wrong to think about it in terms of reports and books, because the depreciable life of the IMF reports about, each economy in the world that they publish once a year on each country, they're very valuable in the moment, but the depreciable life is incredibly rapid. Like, go back and read the article, I think it's Article 4 reports or Article 6 reports, I can never remember, on any country, and you'll get a great snapshot in time of what the IMF thinks of that particular economy. But 6 months go by and it's completely obsolete. I was doing this just yesterday on the Knowledge platform where Indonesia announced better than expected Q2 growth figures. And I went back and there was a World Bank report from June 2023 all about how Indonesian growth was going to suck. So the depreciable life of that World Bank report, as insightful as it was at the time and all the data that it had, was kind of zero because it was totally wrong. But the reason I say that is because I think you're right. There's news, there's books, there's reports that you can get online. But this is the other thing that the internet has done, because we assume that you can get to anything on the internet, and it's just not true. Like, not every single book that has been published in the history of the world is available to you on the internet. In fact, most of them probably aren't. And I think part of the work from homes, I don't know whether it's work from home or the decline of libraries. Like, even I don't get to a library as often as I mean to, and people just don't go to libraries anymore. They think they can go on Google or they can go on YouTube and things like that. And you'd be surprised, like, what books and insights you can find in the bowels of a library somewhere, some book or author that nobody had ever heard of, but which actually has something to communicate about time periods right now. But you're also, the last thing I'll say about this is, I feel the pain of what you're talking about. I am somebody who's been a pretty voracious reader all of his life, and I have struggled since having a kid to read as much as I used to. And I feel like my pyramid has been all crazy because I have to read a bunch of the news every day. Like, what is a geopolitical analyst if he can't talk about what's going on in the news? But I've lost a little bit of my pyramid base here over the last 11 months. So I'm trying, I read things here and there, but for listeners may not know this, I have felt over the last 11 months sort of spread a little bit too thin because I don't feel like I have the normal base like I used to. So I'm pulling back from the reaches of my mind or looking back to books that inspired me in the past and trying to interpret things that way. And I sometimes feel a little bit stale and a little bit self-conscious about the things that I'm saying because they don't have sort of that same level of depth underneath them. So take those in any direction that you want. But those were my thoughts to what you were saying.
Yeah, well, I think that gets to one of the biggest challenges and one of the reasons why most people don't do this, because it's very easy to default to reading the news, especially in our job. Mm-hmm. If I don't know what's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, given what I do or given what anyone, in a professional role does, they look silly. There's a certain peer pressure to not be out of the flow. And it's very difficult to resist in a professional environment. It's because you can always defer the longer term stuff, the longer depreciable life stuff. You can always say, oh, I'll do that tomorrow. I'll do it this weekend. I'll do it next week. I'm just too busy. There's this thing just happened. Like, take this banking crisis in air quotes that we saw a few months ago. At the time we came out and said, this really isn't a big deal. But how many dozens of hours did people waste of their individual time reading about that, worrying about it, kind of hemming and hawing about it. And in the end, 2 years from now, we're not going to really think about it as anything other than a footnote to, hey, this happened in 2023. That's right. So even the things that seem the most pressing in the moment, you have to put them in perspective. And that's very, very hard It's sort of like diet and exercise. You don't see the results right away of reading longer form stuff, of reading books, of reading the stuff that matters, that gives you kind of an underlying knowledge of the fundamentals of things, because you're not going to use it that day. But just like diet and exercise, you need to do it a little bit every day and be disciplined about it. But because, you don't lose weight on day one of eating well and exercising, most people don't do that. Most people give up. It's the biggest challenge to losing weight, is like, you don't lose weight within 3 hours. You have to wait at least 2 weeks. And reading is much the same way. And that's not to say that it's about length, because sometimes you can get insights from a single newspaper article that are much more valuable than some 800-page history book. It's all about the quality and sort of the curation, but just this sort of approach where you're deliberately trying to pick out, okay, what is the value of what I'm reading, instead of doing it indiscriminately. There's a great value to that. And the other thing I just want to riff on, when you talk about sort of the inefficiencies, that knowledge is everywhere and getting information is no longer an edge. One anecdote I always loved, I'm not a huge Ray Dalio fan, and I think, there's a lot of flaws with the way that he approaches things, and I don't buy into his whole shtick, essentially. But he had a really wonderful quote, and I think it was in either 2010 or 2012 during one of the EU sovereign debt crises. And during one of those times, Bridgewater just absolutely nailed it, and they had a very good period. And I remember him being interviewed, and they said, "Ray, how did you predict that the EU crisis was going to happen now?" Because everyone, I don't know if you remember this, everyone was running around like chickens with their heads cut off talking about this. And he just said, because that's when the payments were due. And it was just sort of this very matter-of-fact approach where he said, because we actually got to the bottom of things and said, okay, here's the numbers. Here's the fundamentals of what's going on. Here's when the payments are actually due. And that's when there's going to be a problem. And I don't know if I'm expressing that right, but the number of people who make analytical judgments about something, who say, oh, semiconductors are going to do this or that or the other thing, who don't even know the thing that they're trying to judge about. How many people can tell you how a semiconductor actually works? What are the different parts? What are the processes? That stuff is not just academic, it's fundamental. Just like knowing when the payments were due was a fundamental and seemingly obvious part of understanding that complex situation. And yet, because we're so tied into sort of the shallows of news and not things where you're digging deep, even though the information is readily available, there's still that inefficiency, and most people aren't going to that level.
Yeah, well, there's a ton there too. I mean, one of the reasons the consulting firm Perch Perspectives that I started, one of the reasons we named it Perch Perspectives was we were looking for a name that communicated exactly what you just said about Ray Dalio. You're on the perch, you have the right perspective. So much of generating analytical insights is, are you seeing things from the right point of view? Because if you are, it can actually be very simple. I started my career at Stratfor not working directly with clients or doing investing or anything like that. My first job at Stratfor was to write articles. So to be a part of the news media in some sense. And, when I first started, I wanted to cram every single piece of knowledge that I had into every article, because I wanted every person who read my articles to be like, wow, this guy is super smart. And there's so many different facts and brilliant things in there. And Roger Baker, who's been on this podcast before, shout out to Roger, and who sort of trained me in the analyst development program at Stratfor. It took me years to internalize something that he tried to teach me from day one, which was, all you need for an article is one thought. Doesn't have to be like, if you have 10 different thoughts going into an article, it's going to be a pretty crappy article. Just give yourself 800 or 1,000 words to develop one thought. And if it's the right thought, if it's the good thought, it's absolutely going to be a great article. And I think that's as true of writing articles as it is doing geopolitical analysis, as it is with investing, because it's that Hemingway iceberg principle. The amount of work that goes into being able to give an answer like, because that's when the payments are due, there's a monumental amount of work behind that comment. And if you've done the work, it usually does boil down to something that is that simplistic. And the reason that kind of stuff doesn't get that much play is because that's a bad TV segment right there. That's a one-liner that communicates real truth, like he went down and drug up some real truth, but that's not what the media wants, and that's not what the media sells. You gave your newspaper quote. My favorite newspaper quote is H.L. Mencken. A newspaper is a device for making the ignorant more ignorant and the crazy crazier. I mean, we talked about the illusion of moral decline on this podcast, that article in Science a couple months ago. Newspapers, and it's not their fault. Like, I'm not blaming, I respect journalists. We had a journalist on the podcast earlier this week. Like, journalists are absolutely important, but people want to read bad things. Newspapers cover bad things. They don't actually cover new things or things that are necessarily going well. And if they do, it's not on the front page. And even if it is on the front page, it's not the thing that anybody read. You're not going to go to the dinner party at the end of the week and be like, hey, did you see that article about how everything's great? No, you're going to be like, hey, did you see that article about how the bear escaped the crate on its way to Iraq in the airplane or something like that? That was a real story from the New York Post this week. So just to say, there's all that. And I do think it's not just newspapers. Like, this is also infecting every level of our information economy right now, because books used to be the last refuge of where you could still get real insights. And you can to a certain point, but you might have seen this. Paramount just sold Simon & Schuster to a private equity firm earlier this week. It's like, what is the private equity firm going to do? Are we just going to have ChatGPT writing books about things, so that the sort of cheap books that you can page through? Are they going to start evaluating every single book based on how well it's going to sell versus, is this interesting? Is it something to be preserved for posterity that should be put down in print? Even then, it's getting harder and harder to get real access to information. And just the last thing I'll say is Robert Kaplan, who's another. I haven't talked to Robert in a couple of years, but worked closely with him at Stratfor, and he used to bang this home into our heads when he was at Stratfor that reading the news, reading information was exactly like your diet. Like, if you eat at McDonald's every day, like, your body, your mind, you will feel a certain way. If you consume intellectual junk food every day, if you do nothing but look at Jordan Peterson clips and Ben Shapiro clips and whatever other clips you're looking at on YouTube, like Joe Rogan clips, like eventually that junk food is going to express itself into your intellectual views. And Joe Rogan is actually a very interesting one. I know that some listeners will be surprised that I pay attention to Joe Rogan. Of course I do. He's like one of the biggest media personalities in the United States. If you want to understand how media, what moves the needle in the United States, whether you like the dude or not, you need to follow what he's talking about, because he does move the needle for tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans. But the one good thing you can say about Rogan is his podcasts are like 3 hours long. He's sitting there talking to guys all over the place. But the reason he's popular is not the 3 hour podcast. Probably I don't know what percentage of his audience listens to the full 3 hour podcast, but they chop it up into little pieces and they put it on YouTube clips or Instagram Reel. I don't know what all the fangled things are, but you get these short 1-2 minute sound bites, and that's what people consume. And then they go after it rather than actually hacking into the long form. So yeah, I mean, it's, and I also want to say this. You and I feel peer pressure to read the front page every day, I think, or to be up on the front page every day. And you do better at avoiding this than I do, because sometimes we get on the podcast and I'm like, hey, did you hear this thing about the Fed and interest rates? And you're like, no, I was doing deep research on nuclear fusion, Jacob. And I was like, oh shit, I should be doing deep research on nuclear fusion. What am I doing looking at the headlines here? But part of the reason we feel that, just last up, part of the reason we feel that peer pressure is we're still trying to raise AUM, like we're trying to show people, hey, we're here. We're trying to get in the algorithm. We're trying to get in front of people. If we ever go deathly silent, it means that somebody has taken a big bet on us, or that I won. I haven't checked the lottery numbers yet. For all I know, I'm a cajillionaire right now. It means we won the lottery, and we will spend our time doing nothing but deep thinking, and we won't be here anymore. So there is that juxtaposition too. Like we're part of the environment.
Yeah, you mentioned like Joe Rogan and what I would say call kind of mainstream media. But it's not just that, because I know most of our listeners don't listen to that, I would imagine. And they're like me. Like when I first started, I would read 7 newspapers cover to cover every day. I would read The Economist, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and they're covered with this aura of, oh, well, like this is healthy. This is health food. You're learning. This is intellectual. It's financial. You're learning about the world, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just more skeptical of that than I used to be, because it feels so good. And then afterwards, you're like, well, what did I really get deep on this week? Like it's like a lot of our listeners, in other words, like we say, oh, don't listen to Jordan Peterson clips or whatever. And they'll say, yeah, so those idiots who listen to Jordan Peterson are not like that. But really, like the Wall Street Journal is a wonderful newspaper, and so the Financial Times is a wonderful newspaper. But this applies even more to those, because it's not obvious that you're overindulging when it's wrapped up in the aura of respectability and seriousness. And I think in many ways that's the bigger trap for a lot of people, and certainly it was for me until I started trying to be more deliberate about it.
Well, and just to your point there, I don't want anyone to think for a second I'm throwing shade at journalists. I mentioned this, but I'll say it a little more directly. I love having journalists on the podcast because journalists are incredibly insightful. They're the ones who are on the ground, sometimes risking their lives to cover important events. Most of the insights, the things that they see, don't make it into the newspaper because that's not what sells. Like the editors and everybody up the chain, fashions it into 800 words that they think are going to sell the newspapers at the end of the day. And then Mencken and Charles Lamb and all those guys and analyze what's coming out of the newspaper. But the episode that I just recorded with Paul Melly on Niger is a great example. If you just go on Muckrack and read all of his articles, it looks like a garden variety journalist who's just covering some shit in Africa. But then he comes on this podcast, and for an hour, he's spellbindingly telling me all the stuff about the Sahel and Niger that I didn't know and that I've been searching for literally months. And he's got it all in his head because he's been covering this stuff and on the ground for literally 40 years. So just want to be clear, journalists, if you're listening, I'm not throwing shade at you. Like we're all part of this this meat machine, this processing machine. And when things get to the top of the bubble, it's like you guys actually have way more insight than you're probably being compensated for. And the ironic thing about journalists is that the newspapers have convinced them to work for them, whereas they actually have probably more like valuable information at their fingertips than just about anybody else in the world.
Yeah, it's not don't hate the players, hate the game. In other words, the journalists themselves are not the problem. It's the fact that the media and research providers, more generally, they have an incentive not to enlighten you per se, not to help you in your journey, your curious journey trying to find out more about the world. Their incentive is to get you to pick up the thing or to click on the thing every day. And those are subtly different, but very important differences in those incentives. And you need to be aware of that. We say this all the time, like we're an investment firm. We don't sell access to this podcast. We're not here to try to get you to compulsively figure out, what's Jacob going to say next? We're not in the content business. We're in the making good judgments about investments business. And that I think is refreshing because we don't have to be on the treadmill, but it is a treadmill, and you really should recognize that.
Yeah.
I've had a number of like people in their early 20s reach out to me in the last few months and say, how do I get started? Much like you described with geopolitics. How do I get started? How do I become a good investor, over the next 10 years? What do I read? What do I do? And the number one thing that I tell them, just getting to this flipping the pyramid idea, is to take 2 hours of every day and just make them inviolable. That is your reading time. That is your study time. It's the time to read things that aren't tied to the current moment, whatever that is. And you need to be very selective and choose only high quality stuff. But the temptation to violate that and just say, oh, I'm too busy, not today, is so strong that it's like your exercise. Find a time every day, whether it's at lunch, before work, whatever, put a timer on, turn off the Wi-Fi, and just sit there and read whatever that long-lived piece of information may be. And that is something that 99% of people, even very, very serious and hardworking people, do not do. And you will have a huge advantage if you flip the pyramid like that.
Yeah. When people ask me what to read, I invariably, my first answer to that is, it doesn't matter. Just start reading. Like, pick something good. Like, you'll eventually find what you need to find. But for me, like, I learned more about political power and the exercise of political power from reading Robert Caro than any textbook I ever read in my entire life. And Robert Caro has written 5 books, I believe, in his life, 1 massive biography of Robert Moses, and then 4 out of 5 volumes so far of a biography series on Lyndon B. Johnson. And I'm waiting for the 5th book, like some people, well, not like some people, like I also waited for, Harry Potter books when I was growing up as well. And I'm deathly afraid that Robert Caro, who's getting up there in age, is not going to make it. But let's not dwell on that macabre thought. The reason I bring him up is because nobody believed in Robert Caro when he was doing his massive omnibus on Robert Moses, which actually I believe the editors cut down, like it's already like 1,000 pages, and apparently like editors cut down another 1,000 pages. So it was even that much more so. But it took him literally years to write. His wife went back to work. They double mortgaged their house or something like that. He also spent 6 to 8 months like laid up in a bed because he had some back problem while he was doing all this research. And yes, he sort of made it successfully, but it was that level of grit and determination that it took for him to get to the finish line. No publisher believed in him. Nobody wanted to publish this absolutely brilliant, like earth-shattering book that he spent all this time on. It was just out of sheer force of will that he pushed it through the system. Not all of us have that kind of supernatural level of determination and grit that Robert Caro had. Just think of how many insights are probably sitting there on the cutting room floor because somebody didn't want to look at them. And I think that kind of gets into, I think, the next part of what we wanted to talk about, which is, okay, like we've sort of talked about the media environment and where we sit within it and all the problems with it. And you sort of alluded to, Rob, that your advice is to spend 2 hours a day just reading the deep stuff or doing that deep research. But how do you gather information? What are the mental modes that you're using for reading the news? Because you can't ignore it completely. Like, you're going to look like an idiot if you don't at least interact it with somehow completely. So how do we translate some of what we're talking about here into tangible strategies or tactics for the folks that are listening?
Well, that's an interesting question because the news is sort of a different challenge, I think. That's how I would classify it. It's a challenge because it's easy to say, hey, take 2 hours a day and read books. Like, plenty of people say that. And it's not difficult to implement if you have the desire to do it. And it's not just books. Like, it's anything long form where you're learning the fundamentals. It could be a textbook about some aspect of technology or science or whatever, but you know what I mean. So how do you, like, you can't just go in the ivory tower and shut yourself off and ignore the world, especially if you do what we do. You have to be on top of markets, on top of what's happening day to day. And even for those listeners of ours who are, the majority of them are not active in markets, but in your day-to-day job, you can't just roll in and not know who the president is. So at some margin, you need to incorporate the news. So how do you do that? The way I would think about it is this. If you think of sort of the spectrum of depreciable life as one mental image, the news, I would imagine, the image I would lay out is picture a big muddy field. And in that field, there's a handful of little diamonds. So your job is not to read the news, because what most people do is they approach it in the completely wrong way. What most people do is they do a very mediocre skim of everything. They're just looking at different articles, flipping through the websites. Maybe you have a physical newspaper and you're flipping through. No one is looking very deeply at anything, but you're looking and sort of reading lots of things. That's the exact wrong way to do it. What you should do, rather than take that sort of mediocre skim approach, is you should take a barbell approach. You should ignore 98% of everything. And as you're scanning, as you're gathering, I like to think of it in terms of different mental modes. There's a gathering mode, and then there's a reading mode. Mm-hmm. The gathering mode is sort of greedy and grasping and outward looking, and you're at the buffet and oh, that looks good, and that looks good, and that looks good. And you're not actually consuming anything. You're just evaluating what you may want to read. And this is really important. In the gathering mode, you're not reading anything. You're thinking in a meta way as you skim through the website. And we'll talk about some of the tools that I find really useful to do this on a day-to-day basis. But you're just looking and you're thinking about it in a meta way to say, what is this article? Why are they writing this? Oh, this is a piece. Oh, it's a fluff piece on, this story. I can skip that. This is a piece about, oh, the Japanese prime minister said blah, 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 blah. Like, whatever, who cares? When you're in gathering mode, that's the approach you want to take. You're not evaluating the content. You're evaluating a slightly different question, which is, do I put this in my pile or not? And what criteria do I use? Once you have the pile and you separate that out, then you have a separate time for reading mode. And I think this is really important because when I talk about that barbell approach, you want to take that 2 to 5% of the news that could be the diamonds in the mud, and you want to sit down at that and read it much more closely and carefully than anyone else is reading any other newspaper article. And I'm not pulling this out of my butt either. If you look at Jesse Livermore, for example, one of the greatest investors and traders in history who lived in a very different time. There's a good book written by another trader named Richard Wyckoff, who wrote about Jesse Livermore and his methods. And one of the things he would point out is he would say that Jesse Livermore, he'd come in the morning and he would have the physical newspaper, because this was the 1920s, and he would ignore 98% of the news. He wouldn't even read it. He would just scan it super quickly. And then he would find one article and he'd cut it out and he would sit down and he'd read that article very, very carefully, because he knew that there was going to be some insight, something he would learn, some piece of information. And this was a time when information was scarce in that little diamond that was going to be the thing that was to be extracted from that day's news. So I think that's the general approach that no one does, but I think is very useful to get those two different mental modes. Because then when you're in reading mode, once you've gathered everything, you've saved it in your pile, whether that pile is a virtual one on your, in a Dropbox folder, or whether it's a physical one where you print stuff out. Then you disconnect. You get away from the buffet cart because you're going to be distracted. Then you have your discrete pile of stuff to read, and then you get into reading mode, which is calm, contemplative, focused, not grabby. And then you digest everything. And if you can use that as a method to extract the diamonds from every day's news, not only are you saving a lot of time, but also you're getting much more value out of the stuff that you do read than most people do, who are just kind of trying to shove everything into their face all at once and not able to satisfactorily enjoy any individual piece of food at the buffet.
Yeah. The other part of this, and this is another, a lot of what we're saying here is contrarian or is not conventional wisdom. But your ability to do what you're talking about, especially like in terms of volume, declines over time. Like I right now am in my analytical prime for being able to gather a bunch of information, sit down and read it, and still do the deep research. I'm at that perfect sort of inflection point where I'm young enough, I can gather all the shit that I need to, and my mind is flexible enough and I can remember it and I have recall of all those things. But then I can go off and I can do 3 hours of deep research and write it, and everything sort of feeds back and forth to each other. we assume in sort of, American capitalism that you get better at your job linearly over time, and we compensate people more over time. Everything is kind of that way. But as I've learned in analysis, your ability to do what you're talking about, to do the gathering and the parsing of all these different things that are happening, actually declines over time. So when you get to your 50s and your 60s as an analyst, what you have is experience, insight, that deep knowledge base from reading things deeply over a period of decades. But what you lose is the ability to be the tip of the point of the spear and to go in and skim 100 different articles and come out with a pile of 20 and read them carefully and find the 2 or 3 that are going to be most important, and then change your mind about your views based on those 2 or 3 diamonds that you've read. By the time you're 50 or 60, it's actually, no, I've been reading stuff for the last 50 to 60 years. Like, I know something deep about this thing that nobody else knows because most people weren't around for the last time something like this happened, and I can provide this deep and meaningful insight. All of which is to say, like, if you're older, or if you're part of a team that is older, there actually is a major function for having younger people on the team, because what younger people lack in history and insight and experience and things like that, they make up for with fresh eyes, looking at the newspaper and being able to say, well, actually, I haven't seen that before. Maybe it is interesting. I'm going to put it on the pile just in case. And maybe that's the time that particular article matters so much. It was true at Stratfor. I tried to make it true at GPF, and I think we're trying to make it true at CI. There's a tremendous import to having diversity on your teams. And I don't just mean diversity in the PC, like we all must bow to the totem of diversity. I mean like having age diversity and geographic diversity and diversity of experience, having people who look at the same article and come away with 3 different conclusions. And then you go into a room and for an hour you discuss the 3 different views about the one article and come out with hey, so the client should do this, or hey, the payments are due sort of X date. Like that's when you really start to move from just, your own individual gathering, but your ability to work things off of other people and to really, the compound interest of your depreciable knowledge, if you will, as you start to bounce things off of other people on your team.
I wonder if part of this is because you and I are both millennials, so we sort of straddle that gap in between the world of printed texts and the world of TikTok. Because I do think that's right. As you get older, your ability to just process, and maybe it's not getting older, maybe it's just older people are less good at that than people who have been raised in on a digital age from the time they were very young. They have a much easier time to process things in that way. But the one advantage that one has, the longer you do it, and this is independent of when you were born or your generation or whatever, but the longer you read the news, the less of the news you have to read. And I think that's an important distinction, because when I talk about going into gathering mode and thinking in a meta way, the longer you've been reading newspapers, the better you are at making quick assessments of why is this article in the newspaper and how likely is it that it's going to have something that I actually want to dive into. So like, for example, there was this piece in the Financial Times. I put it on the Knowledge platform just to kind of rip into it. But I think it was entitled, stodgy old heat pumps are revolutionizing greenery in Europe, or something like that. And right away, I knew this article was bunk, and like why the journalist was writing it. They're trying to take a data point from last year and extrapolate this big trend and say, oh, heat pumps are this big thing. It doesn't matter the details. But the only reason I could do that was because I've been reading the Financial Times for 20 years. And you learn to think in a meta way about this. But it only works if you deliberately put yourself into that mode. Because otherwise you're just wallowing in the information and, oh, maybe this is an interesting article, I'll read this. So people get better at that as time goes on. That's for sure.
The flip side of that, though, is that like that can also be a weakness, because the better you get at that, the more likely you are to dismiss things that actually are important. So like the shining example of this to me was at Stratfor. There was an article about a vegetable salesman or whatever he was who lit himself on fire in protest of bad police treatment I think it wasn't in Tunis, but it was in Tunisia, some city in Tunisia. I'm forgetting the name of the city off the top of my head right now. And I remember I was on charge of publishing desk that day, and to his credit, the guy who was the North Africa analyst said, "We need to write about this. This is important. This hasn't happened before." And I was like, "Protest in a Middle Eastern country? Like, what's the big deal? Like, come on, we've got like 3 much better articles than this that we're going to publish. Don't worry about it." And that was the exact wrong thing to do, because that started the Arab Spring. And it took us 3 weeks to figure out, hey, like there was something weird there about that. So there is this thing where you have to be able to parse through and read things very quickly. But if you get too familiar, if you get too accustomed, if you get too confident in your own ability to do that, you will lose that ability to stop at an article and just sort of go, huh, that's weird. Like, I should think about this a little bit more. And it's hardest also because, you know, everybody in this media environment today, you want to have takes. Like, what's your take on this? Or you want to have a position or a forecast or things like that. And, you know, forecasts, all these things, they're only as good as until the next major thing happens. And if you're in the selling content business and you're too worried about your take or whatever your forecast or position was, it becomes very hard to stop and say, hey, you know what I've been talking about for the last 3 to 6 months and feeling very passionately about? Turns out it was wrong. And here's the initial evidence. And I'm completely changing my mind. And you should still listen to me, because I'm like, that sort of process doesn't happen in public most of the time, because again, it just like that Ray Dalio thing, that doesn't tell a nice compact story that people can interact with. So just to say, like, you're absolutely right about the ability to parse and get through the news fast, but you also have to have enough. In some ways, you have to have enough instability in your routine so that you're not completely comfortable. So that when you come across something and you get that spidey sense and you stop and you're like, all right, like, my instinct is to dismiss this, but something here is wrong, and I'm not going to ignore that weird feeling that something's wrong, even if 90% of the time it's going to be worthless and not be that important.
Yeah, I think that gets the nail on the head in many ways. And I've experienced this myself. I think this is the danger of having more experience and being able to think in a meta way, because sometimes you get too meta if you get in a rut. So what I mean by that is, for example, my mentor as a short seller, I remember as he got older, the mistakes he would make would be dismissing things too easily and applying mental models from past companies or past cases or past ideas that we had done, applying them too readily to situations that were different. And I think no matter which field you're in, complacency is not the right word, but not shaking up your mental models enough is a potential risk. And one way to try to alleviate that is, as you mentioned, to keep yourself on your toes, whether that's by consuming lots of different things and sort of questioning your mental models a lot, or doing other things to just, light a fire under your butt a little bit. Because I worry about that every day. When the analysts on the team come and say, oh, and I say, no, it's this. I think, oh my God, am I doing that now too? So I hope they're not listening to this. But
yeah, they probably don't care. They're probably on TikTok right now. But I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a second, which is to say, this is why I get so ornery when people talk about Cold War with China, because that is about people in the U.S. foreign policy and intelligence establishment. They have Cold War models in their heads, and the Cold War with the Soviet Union never really came to a head. But now they're just taking that mental model and they're being like, Cold War with China. We're just doing another Cold War with China. And I hate that, because it has nothing to do with the old Cold War. It's completely different. But the way that it's being refracted from the folks who were actually, the top people who are at the levels here, those are still folks who were trained in the Cold War, who think about the Cold War. Like the young millennials of the heady 90s are not in those top positions of power, or not making those editorial decisions in general. And that's why you get this Cold War thinking, I think, in the United States. And maybe it's right, by the way. Like, a bipolar world is one of the scenarios I think that is possible over the next 10 or 15 years. But if you've listened to me for long enough, you know that I think the world is moving multipolar. And that, I think, is also a good thing to sort of dwell on here for a second, because we can talk about geopolitics and China and the Philippines, like all this stuff that we talk about on this podcast all the time. But geopolitics in some ways is very boring. I said this in our paper about innovation and investing. If you were a good geopolitical analyst from roughly 1991 to 2018, you should have just said, it's a unipolar world. The United States is the most powerful country in the world. That's the most important insight you need. Whether you're a company, whether you're making supply chains, whether you're making investment decisions, it's the United States. And we can talk about all the other stuff. And I'm sure there is stuff happening in the weeds that is very, very important to you, and we can talk about it. But if you take a step back, it should have been the same answer for almost 30 years. The United States is top dog. And right now, for us, that answer is we think we're headed towards a multipolar world. And we do all this analysis, we're gathering information about all these other things. But in some ways, the payments or due line for us is, we're moving multipolar, rising and falling great powers. We think there are advantages in some countries and disadvantages in some countries. And then we think these will affect these industries and go, but that's the sort of major point. And if we ever get to the point where that thesis looks wrong and it is moving more bipolar, Cold War type thinking, or it is moving back unipolar, or if it's moving towards Ian Bremmer's G0 chaos sort of thing, or if it's moving towards World War, we'll have to sit down and we'll have to change everything. But I can't get up on here every week and tell you, hey, it's multipolar. And that's what's defining our investment research on the geopolitical side, because that would be boring. I have to bring in folks who are talking about the things that are going on a daily basis. But in some ways, that's the insight. Like, that's the one that we have here. It's the one that we're going to be pushing forward.
Wait, G0 chaos? That sounds like some kind of energy drink or something. I'm not familiar with that theory.
No,
we don't have to
I
get into it. But
No, I think I was talking a little too, like Ian Bremmer's book is G0, and G0 is basically the idea that there it's no rising and falling, it's just chaos out there. Like, everything is bouncing all over the place. And because I think sometimes I don't know Ian that well. Sometimes Ian Bremmer, people sort of throw him into the multipolar camp. He's really not in the multipolar camp with us. The only other geopolitical analyst I know out there who's in the multipolar camp with us, full stop, is Marco Papic. Like, he and I are in the multipolar world, but like no other, like Peter, George, like nobody else is sort of sitting in that multipolar world the way that we are. And I think it's interesting that the only other geopolitical analyst in the US I know who's thinking that way is also in the investment world. Like, I think when you actually start talking about making investments, like, multipolarity doesn't become political or ideological as it is in a lot of different other circles. It's just like, well, no, actually, the opportunities are in Brazil or in Indonesia or in Turkey. And so follow that back. What does that mean? How do you parse through that? In some ways, our objectives there are defining our view.
Another idea that I think is worth talking about a little bit is the way that knowledge compounds over time. So one of the things that I've noticed, just to keep this in the geopolitical context, that I've noticed you're really good at is you have these insights that are sort of fundamental, deep insights about different countries, different ideas. Take Mexico, for example. The idea that Mexico City has always traditionally struggled to sort of express its power into the more farther reaching or remote areas of Mexico, and that's sort of a pattern that you've seen throughout history. Like, I've seen you when doing analyses of, hey, here's what's happening in Mexico today, here's what's in the news about this, that, or the other thing, sort of use that as a foundation to understand and put context around and sort of give meaning to the day-to-day developments of of Mexico, or whatever topic it is that you want. And I think it illustrates a really important thing, which is the more that you spend time building your knowledge of the context of the deep fundamentals around whatever it is, whether it's the history of Mexico, semiconductor technology, just how humans work, whatever that is, it provides a deeper and deeper and deeper foundation to the next thing that you're reading. And it provides context to the next thing that you're reading. And I think that knowledge, it helps compound over time. It helps you parse out the day-to-day stuff, but it also builds on itself, and it informs your longer form reading more and more and more as time goes on, which is why whenever these guys, who are inevitably like 21, say, hey, what should I be doing? I say, start reading, and read like more than you think you should now. Because God, I wish when I was 21, like, I read a lot, but I was kind of stupid about it. I would just read whatever and slapdash. But if I were really, really good, I would have had a system and really carved out even more time. That's what I think young people should be doing as early as possible, because the sooner you start building that, it's like saving for retirement. The sooner it compounds and the more it compounds by the time you're 50 or 60. I mean, there's a longevity thing here where it's extraordinary how exponentially that can grow.
Yeah, it's funny. There's another thing though, like, and what we're really talking about right now, in my experience, is actually the easy part. And it's not easy what we're talking about, but it's the easier part. I have trained or tried to train many analysts now in my lifetime that I've been doing this. And I always tell them, like, look, I can give you the strategies and I can tell you how to think about things and what to read and teach you how to write and think, all these other things. But the analysts I've worked with who have been successful, or who have gone on to successful careers, or this, that, or the other thing, it wasn't about their ability to read correctly or write correctly. Like, yes, like there's a basic minimum of like competence you have to have, but it's actually more psychological. It's about developing enough confidence to think, oh, I'm smart about this. Like, I'm not afraid of saying what I think about this, even if I'm not the expert on it right now, or even though I don't think I'm the expert. Going back to the idea of depreciable amount of information. And Mexico, let's use Mexico in particular. I'm not a Mexico expert. I don't speak Spanish. I am not a deep expert on all things Mexico and things like that. But I've worked on a number of client projects in Mexico. I've thought very deeply about some things in Mexico. And you're right, I do have a framework for how Mexico works. Now, I could not walk into any university and even get a master's degree in Mexico, let alone a PhD. And if you gave me 8 years to become an expert on supply chain disruption through northern Mexico, I could become the greatest expert on that thing in the history of the world. And by that time, companies would care absolutely zero. So there's this balance between the amount of time that you get to take to become the expert and giving the company or the investor the information they need when they need it. Because you don't have 7 years to become the expert on this thing. You have 2 weeks to plumb the depths and give them something that allows them to make a better decision in general. And that ultimately comes down, number one, to confidence, having enough confidence to say, I trust my method. I trust all the work that I've put in here. I have something to say. I have an insight. And yes, I don't have the credential, or I haven't spent 7 years doing it, but I know how to do this, and I know how to dive deep into this, and I stand by the analysis and the work that I've done behind it. The second thing is, if you're right about a lot of these things as an analyst, it's going to be lonely. Because usually when you write about stuff, it is not conventional opinions. And you have to be willing to say things that people are going to look at you funny and be like, are you sure about that? That's not what most people are saying. And for me, I know that I'm onto something usually when my take is does not go with the grain. A really good example of this is, our position on Brazil earlier this year. We were talking about how optimistic we were about Brazil even before the January 8th and through the January 8th political crisis that happened in Brazil. And everybody was trashing us, me in particular on Twitter, about this position on Brazil. The Economist has an article this week, Brazil's economy is attracting investors. So 8 months ago, we were very, very lonely, but we had the courage to say, no, we've done the work. This is what we think. And it's funny. I mean, I was reading and doing all the stuff that you might want me to do, 21, 22, but I didn't learn that confidence lesson, honestly, until I went to grad school and I had to write a master's dissertation. And I remember being so intimidated by this dissertation. It was on a very esoteric topic. My grandmother and all of 2 other people have read it. It won an award at the University of Oxford, by the way. So if any of you want to read about Leo Strauss and Abraham Joshua Heschel and the relationship between religion and philosophy, you're welcome to reach out. I'm welcome to send it to you. It was a brilliant piece. It probably won't matter to anybody that much. But I was incredibly intimidated about the initial phases of this research project, because I was like, whoa, but this is such an important topic. And how am I ever going to, I have 2 years to write this thing. How am I ever going to learn enough in 2 years to know what I'm talking about? And I realized in my 3rd meeting with my advisor that just based on the reading and research and sort of outlining that I had done for 2 months and 3 meetings into the advisor, that I already knew more than she did. Like, she was just the gatekeeper to the credential, but she hadn't been spending time parsing Leo Strauss's early works and Abraham Joshua Heschel's works. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head. It was like, oh, so like I'm actually the expert on this right now because I'm the one who has spent 40 hours on this topic, because probably nobody else has spent more than 2 hours on this topic. So I say all that to say there's also, you need a certain level of humility like when you're doing this kind of, you're supplying information quickly in real time, you're going to be wrong sometimes. And that means when I'm wrong about something, I try to be the first one to raise my hand and say, okay, I was wrong. Here's why I was wrong. Hopefully in my initial analysis, there is some sort of scenario in there about some part that I'm less sure about, or some part that I haven't deeply researched enough, or that I couldn't find information about. Usually I'm pretty good about doing that. But it's that combination of confidence and humility that most people who want to be in this group, they just don't have it. And that's a temperamental thing. I can't teach the confidence and I can't teach the humility. You can get 90% of the way there on your own, but if you don't have those two more intangible tasks, or those two intangible qualities, it's not going to work. Not only is it not going to work for you, you're not going to enjoy it. Like, the life of the analyst is lonely, and means you're comfortable being contrarian. And if you're not comfortable with those things, doesn't matter how many books you read, it's not going to work for you.
Well, I think being a generalist lends itself to humility in many ways. The research firm that we have that has been around since 1990 is literally called Off Wall Street. So what I mean by that is, like, I'm not a particularly intelligent person. Like, I'm just not. Like, the horsepower is not running at some like super high level here. But I've been moderately successful at what I do. And I think what that is attributable to is simply because of sort of the generalist approach, which is just taking yourself out of the context of which all the smarter people are fighting and seeing things in a different way. And that's the generalist way. That's, Off Wall Street is literally like, hey, we're not physically around the other people who are all operating within these parameters. We're going to go physically somewhere else. We're going to think about it differently. We're going to come from a different background. We're going to approach it from the outside, and we'll see things that other people don't see. And you don't have to be a genius to do that. There's a humility to that, but it also, as you mentioned, like with your thesis, it's not hard to be the axe on something. And what I mean by that is, like, traditionally on Wall Street, there's all analysts who are covering something. And then one analyst is called the axe. That's the person who knows it best. And that's the one that everyone kind of really follows on the thing, and the rest sort of follow. Mm. It's remarkably easy to become the axe on a subject, and you don't have to spend, months working on it. I know we have a lot of listeners who are in the investment industry, but also a lot who are just in business, who have startups. Whatever you're doing, there's a big inefficiency there. And it's really about creativity and becoming a generalist, which is whatever industry you're in. Say you're in advertising, you have an advertising agency. You can be the axe on blockchain or the axe on, Mexico very easily. It doesn't require very much. It just requires curiosity and sort of the discipline to read some stuff like we talked about. But the ability to take that sort of generalist knowledge and make connections from different places, from different, ways of thinking, different mental models of the world, different experiences, and use that to come up with creative insights about whatever it is that you are doing that are differentiated and give you an advantage over all the other advertising agencies. That is a huge piece of low-hanging fruit that almost nobody picks up. And I'm talking my own book because that's basically my career. Is like, I'm just a guy who has weird views and different views on things because I just read and consume things and occupy a place that's different from what all the genius PhDs who are cranking, the quantitative numbers on all the stocks than what they're doing.
It's funny.
It's widely applicable.
It's fun. You have this innate insecurity about talking our own book, which is always funny to me because this entire podcast is talking our book, and we sort of said it at the beginning, but I'll make it a little more transparent. We don't sell content. We're not selling subscriptions to this podcast. We're not selling ads on this podcast. We're not monetizing it. Like, no money is coming into our pockets from this podcast. We are not in the content selling business. We are in the business of getting in front of people who find this approach attractive and saying, hey, reach out to us, have a relationship with us, one that we hope ends with us managing your assets rather than just giving it to some other person who's going to say, hey, be in this, long fund or whatever, and then I'm going to go play golf based on the fees that I charge you or on the trades that I make you and things like that. So literally, like, even if it's underwater basket weaving in Somalia, like, it all comes back to or whether it's aliens with Matt Pines, like, yes, it's interesting for me, and in some ways it's giving you a window into my own research process, into my own deep thinking time. But the other part of it is that we want to convince you that we are trustful people, that we're doing things differently, and that you actually want to do things with us. So I don't have that same insecurity about talking our book, because everything is our book. What isn't our book? Even aliens happen to be our book, if Matt is right about the secret technologies that are in the bowels of the Pentagon.
Well, I admit to talking our own book, but at the same time, I think our book is the best book. So, we want to make that clear.
Yeah. All right. I think we've been going for an hour. We still have more to talk about, but I think rather than going into tools and giving people some of the things that we wanted to talk about, Rob, I think we should put a pin in it here and say this will be just sort of a recurring topic that we're going to come back to over the course of the next couple months. On the next episode, we will get a little, we've been very highfalutin here. We'll get a little more granular in talking about tools that you might need to do some of these things, more perspectives on how we actually enact some of these things, because I don't want anyone to keel over and fall asleep. And I also technically have a stupid meeting in 2 minutes, which probably won't yield anything, but hey, we have to have the meeting. So there we are.
All right. Well, we'll keep this one very high level and philosophical. And then next time we'll get into the nitty gritty of how to actually implement and what are the underrated tools that we use. See, this is like a real cliffhanger here. What are the underrated tools, the 5 underrated tools that we use that can unlock a productivity explosion for you?
Coming next on Cognitive Dissidence, underrated tools that will make you a millionaire. Tune in then. Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.